that it was conspiracies, because there's something about conspiracy theories which make you think about like they're kind of ethical. It's like there's something wrong with the world, so you're like ethically reacting, and you're also kind of trying to look behind. It's almost like there's even something slightly conspiratorial about Plato's shadows. Like you're trying to look behind the mere appearances of things and so on. So, you know, I think sometimes conspiracy theories can be the seed to something better, if they go with something better. Like it's possible they don't, but you know.
Sure. It's also so. I think the lack of like a proper framework in which to view them is actually quite interesting, because, you know, if you don't have kind of like any sort of like power or like philosophical or political backing, then they've almost like conspiracy theories are more like entertainment products today than they are anything else, you know, like, because you can like, it's almost like when, you know, people like to watch those true crime documentaries, and it's like, oh, it's telling you there's all these horrible things and there's something wrong with the world. But, you know, you can watch like endless conspiracy theory documentaries without, and it's strange because they will tell you all these things like, oh, everyone's lying to you, and, you know, like everything the government tells you is wrong, but you're just there like eating popcorn, and it doesn't actually like affect your life. You just kind of entertainment thing.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the problem with the term, once I call something a conspiracy, I've othered it and I don't have to think about it.
Yeah.
And also the people who follow that conspiracy are automatically stupid, so I don't have to think about what they're thinking. It's funny when we talk, you know, when we call man a rational animal, we don't call him a conspiratorial animal, right? And yet the same processes of thinking that give rise to a conspiracy are arguably the same mental processes that give rise to a giant new brilliant philosophy or theory. Like, one of the things we haven't taken seriously about conspiracies is that they're not irrational. They're products of rationality that just doesn't correspond with anything. Like, if you took QAnon and you were to just make it a novel, like a fiction novel, you'd go, man, this guy's a genius. The writer is such a genius to come up with all these ideas and hand signals. This is so cool. The problem is QAnon is not a fiction work. It is something that people believe is actual, right? But if you were to just take QAnon as a novel, you would easily say, oh, that takes a lot of creative genius to come up with that, right? But when it's like something that people actually believe, then you call it irrational and stupid. So then you act as if it is a different mental process, when it really is the same. And it makes me think, like John Nash, who was the great mathematician at the beginning of that biography of Beautiful Mind, you know, he was talking about all these UFOs and these government conspiracies and different things like that. And this guy at like Princeton or whatever was like, how can you believe all this? Like, how can you, John Nash, believe all this? And he said, well, I mean, it's the same voice that tells me the conspiracies are the ones that tell me about mathematics. You know, it's the same mental process that has the voices in my head that give me these great insights. And we always got to remember, John Nash is not just the father of game theory. He's the father of all of these insights into these very difficult mathematical problems like the Riemann hypothesis. But, you know, if you take someone like John Nash seriously, then you have to like rethink what is rationality entirely. And if we define our ontology, I really like the idea of the ontology of conspiracies, because we basically base human ontology on rationality, and we want to kind of protect that holiness by othering conspiracies. But if conspiracies and rationality have similar processes, then humans may not be, we might be a little more less grand after all.
Yeah, I was going to ask Samuel, what did you mean by ontology? Because you came up with the title for this, so I didn't know what exactly you meant by like ontology.
Yeah, so I take just ontology as a philosophical word to be a kind of a study of like being as such, being qua being sort of thing.
Yeah.
And what I mean is like ontology, like, it depends what you mean by being, of course, but I almost see it as, oh, it's the way you structure and view the world. And obviously the way people structure and view the world, it can be done implicitly without people having to think philosophically, but it has like a philosophical underpinning. And so to kind of bring it back to conspiracy theories specifically, is that if you buy into a conspiracy theory, then ontologically you start to view you have this like epistemological paranoia that affects the way you see the world, you know?
Yeah.
And also, if you're like, you know, you kind of like, well, why is Bill Gates buying up all this farmland? And then, you know, it has a domino effect as well. When you buy into one thing, it often and that makes it easier to buy into other things. So you kind of view every problem as you have a hammer now, and every problem is a nail.
Well, I should note that my friend Lorenzo, who does a lot to rehabilitate people out of conspiracies, will note that very rarely do people believe one conspiracy. They usually believe a lot of conspiracies. Like, so for example, a lot of the flat earthers also believe the moon landing was artificial, and that's why you can't trust NASA. That's why you can't trust the pictures from the satellite. So like, once you open that can of worms of thinking according to conspiracies, well, you really can't avoid thinking a lot of them. So they tend to come in bundles.
Yeah. I definitely think that the epistemic crisis was, I'm thinking back towards like when I was like a teenager and I started looking at conspiracies online. I definitely think like if you put it in the context of social breakdowns of like corrupt political systems, of maybe shifting, one big actually context I would put conspiracies in is the change from like broadcast and newspaper media to the internet. Because it's a pure product of the internet. Like, and I remember like saying to, it was something about 9/11, and my dad was an engineer, and I remember saying to him like, about some specific part of 9/11, and he was like, I've never heard this before, and I was kind of feeling like me, just like the teenager, have this like complete like knowledge that, you know, my father, who's the engineer, the expert, doesn't have. And I remember like showing him the videos and stuff. He was like, that's actually quite weird. Like, that doesn't really make any sense. I've never seen that before. And then this the same thing about 9/11 that was apparently brought up in a courtroom in Denmark or somewhere like that. I don't know why. It was the context was over someone's, it was something to do with someone's company, or like it was completely not related to 9/11 or anything like that. But for some reason, a court full of like a high court in some Scandinavian country was watching this one footage from 9/11, which people don't often hear about, which was weird. And people like, you know, it doesn't really make sense within the narrative we're told. And everyone was shocked that it was this big moment. So I often think that like the popularity of these conspiracy theories are often because the mainstream media and the old media forms are so kind of impotent and sclerotic and behind, and they haven't really been keeping an eye on things and so on. So you have like an intrusion of kind of I don't know how to put it, a sort of an intrusion of information which undermines everything, you know. And there's often no valid response from the old traditional authorities and the old traditional system, so it leads to more paranoia and so forth.
I might be misunderstanding you. I do kind of want to challenge you on one thing there, is that you said that conspiracies are kind of a unique phenomenon of the internet, and I think that's what you started off with. But I think that it's not necessarily true. I think that conspiracy theories have multiplied and become more accessible. I mean, just to give some examples, you know, people were skeptical of the moon landing at the time. Yeah. People were skeptical of the narrative on JFK at the time. And to go back even further, like even in the early, I think it was like late 19th, early 20th century, like the things like the dissemination of the protocols of the Elders of Zion was a thing, you know, and kind of got that ball rolling, you know. But yeah, I wouldn't disagree that they've become more numerous and more disseminated.
But like, it wasn't to say they were specifically a product of the internet, but they could be a product of like the changing media form that we're all like viewing the world from.
Yeah,
like,
there's not
like that shit.
Keeping these sort of things. Like you would have to really be a moon landing skeptic or JFK skeptic back in the day. You would have to like physically go and find like a physical book that was on that subject to tell you as well.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if indeed, like, so you got Bobby Fischer, who falls into conspiracies about Judaism, you know, the Jews running the world. You got Newton going into alchemy, and you've got, you know, like I mentioned, Nash. It seems as if we all know, like, the cliche genius leads to like madness, right? And often, but it's really funny because we still tend to think that madness is the opposite of genius. But if genius correlates with madness, then they actually may kind of share mental processes. Like the more brilliant you are, the more likely you are to come up with a plausible model of reality, ergo a conspiracy that has no correspondence with reality. And you see, the issue is the internet is basically one giant collective consciousness. Therefore, everyone has at their fingertips, the average person has at their fingertips a kind of genius like that of a John Nash, that then if they're just able to use a search engine, they can put together pieces like John Nash was able to do in his brain to come up with these conspiracies about how the government was out to get him, or someone like a Newton come up with how all of these things fit together to prove alchemy. But now the average person has access to like this hyper intelligence online that makes this multiplication. And maybe the strength and power and like the, I almost want to say the epicness of the conspiracies is like larger. Like QAnon is like this giant epic, right? Where the moon landing is more of a contained data point where you kind of say, oh, they faked the moon landing. But now there's this way to come up with almost this entire narrative arc because you have entire groups that are contributing to the writing of the story. And that seems to have a kind of different character to the conspiracy. I would have to think, it's almost like a narrative conspiracy. I'd have to think about it.
It's quite interesting because things like the moon landing, like I said, you go and get a physical book that would speak about this, and it would be like from one specific author. The QAnon stuff is almost like a collaborative effort.
Yes.
I understand that the Q posts come from one trip code, but the law is almost like written by lots of different people, you know?
Yeah, I'm curious about that idea. Like, that's a great word for it. Is today we now have something like conspiratorial lore? You know, that feels like newer. I'm not saying, because I even feel like a lot of the lore people have about the Nazi parties, time traveling and alchemy and all that stuff, that seems to be like later on. Like today being put on it. Yeah. I'm not sure about that, but I'm interested by this kind of like conspiratorial lore. And maybe what it is that modern man has been denied myth. You know, you're not allowed to have myths because that's irrational. So people are creating these new mythologies by which to organize their lives.
Yeah. It's almost a bit like fan fiction in the way that you have contributing kind of countercultural narratives. Sort of, which is kind of what the internet is in a way. It's one giant countercultural narrative to the old system and so forth.
Well,
go ahead.
Not to interrupt, but no one wants to believe a myth that they feel like is just a myth. Like if you're going to follow the mythology of the Bible, you want to feel like there's truth to it, right? Like that God exists. So there's this interesting thing where maybe a conspiracy has this unique mythos power precisely because there are true conspiracies, like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, or the Gulf of Tonkin, or look, like one of the like Wilson very intentionally kind of lied about what the Germans were doing in World War I to get Americans into the war. So then during World War II, when they're like, dudes, they're doing this Holocaust thing, it was harder to get Americans to believe it because they've been like, you tricked us once, you're not going to do it again. And so there's all these kind of interesting examples where governments have engaged with conspiracy. So then if you create a mythos based on conspiracy, it feels plausible. So then it works as a mythos. Because a mythos can't feel as if it's just fiction. It has to feel like it's not fiction to work in the way that humans in their ontology need.
Yeah, and also, have you noticed that once a conspiracy is proven true, it doesn't lead to anything? You know, like for example, with the COVID stuff, it's like, you know, there's a lot about that which actually affirms, oh, some of these conspiracies were actually quite, like, at least intuitively onto something, or I don't, like, there's plenty of them that actually come true. Even RFK is running for president now, and he's basically known off the back of a conspiracy theory, and he's basically saying they killed my was it uncle or and you know, so it's like you see the conspiracy actually kind of almost, he's basically the first kind of conspiracy. He's not a conspiracy theorist, but he's like, he's known for a narrative which is belonging so much to the conspiracy culture. So it's almost like, but like the point I was making, that was a bit of a tangent, but the point I was making was that once something is proven right, more conspiracies come. So like, yeah, so it does show you that, like, it doesn't really function. Sorry, like, it functions as you were saying, as a mythos, not as like, this is wrong, we have to prove it right, and once it's proven right, something happens. Like, nothing really happens at the end of it. It just keeps going. So it would indicate that, like, I think we need new stories, narratives, and myths, which our societies haven't been giving us for a long time, and like these are maybe like the only thing we have.
I think politically it translates into a very good containment strategy as well. I mean, to talk about, I mean, we've been, I think, fairly negative about conspiracies so far in this discussion, but it's true that there are conspiracies in history, and there are conspiracies now, I mean, just to reflect on the language, conspiracy is a word and people do conspire, but the term is conspiracy theory. The attachment of theory on the end makes it seem abstracted from reality, and also makes it seem like someone's hypothesized and just pulled it out the ass, basically.
Right.
I mean, I did want to talk a little bit about the Durham report, which has just come out on the Russian collusion in the 2016 election. And it's quite funny because, and this is very similar with you're trying to find cases where there have been climate alarmism and it's just been completely wrong in the past, and it seems to be getting memory hold. When I searched for the Durham report, I got the Durham report in 1839, which was a report on rebellions in Quebec, Canada. But I'm searching this in 2023, and the Durham report just got released a few months ago. So why was that the top result? Because it's clearly not the one I'm looking for. So yeah, it's so weird because I mean, it's not actually called the Durham report; it's called the Durham Special Counsel Investigation. So they just added all these words to make it more obscure and difficult to find. But basically, what it did is it's again, this is the 2016 election. We're like 7 years from that point now. It was commissioned in 2019 and it's only just been released. And it confirms that the Hillary campaign leaked and spread the Russian collusion narrative, and people went along with it to distract from the whole email server business. Like, it confirms that. And it also shows that, okay, it is investigated like any other one of those claims by the FBI, but the report says that the FBI weren't rigorous when it came to the info they got from sources who were politically inclined, basically. Now, this all comes out if you can go on like obscure subreddits and find this sort of stuff, but this was not front page news anywhere.
Sure.
Like, I don't think you even heard of it, right?
No.
Yeah, like you can find articles on like Fox News and stuff like that, but they are like page 2 news. It's not like page 1 news. Like, you think it would be page 1 news, but that whole Russian interference stuff it didn't work as a narrative for them. So it's yesterday's news. Like, it's not being used anymore.
Right.
I don't know what you guys think about that, but that's what I've been.
Well, I mean, like, I always think about this stuff like it's really obvious. Like they come out like 8 years later and go, "Oh, there was actually." It's just like, duh. I mean, like the first day I saw that headline about Russian collusion, I was like, "This is obviously just like crap to distract." And I feel like most people today, well, maybe older people who still watch the mainstream media, kind of bringing the media politics back into it, but still kind of believe it. But I feel like most young people today are either disinterested or just understand that this is probably like a lot of crap. And then like 8 years later, they go, "Oh, well, actually, And I kind of wonder what's the point in even doing that 8 years later? Like, what's the point in telling us the truth 8 years after?
Well, because it'll get buried. Like, no one cares, and no one's gonna do anything about it.
Oh yeah, and then they can claim that they did do the investigation, which then makes them seem like an unbiased, legitimate institution.
Yeah, the mafia investigates the mafia.
Yeah, that's right. And then you say, "See, look, we're honest." So there's this game that has to be played, where the information has to be released eventually, so that you can then have a kind of plausibility that you're a legitimate institution. Because look, we're checking and balancing ourselves. But you can't release it in a manner when people would then care, because that would, of course, blow up the narrative, right? So there are all these games that have to play. It does make me think of so for example, in religions, there's always this kind of exegesis of a holy text. We were talking about this last night. Like, if you're going to say, no, we want to argue that the Christian can use technology. Well, why not just say that? Why do all the work of going through the Bible, finding the verses that provide some plausibility to that interpretation, and so on and so forth? Well, because if you just straight up as a Christian start using some technology, then why are you still Christian? Or maybe you don't even read the Bible, right? So you go through the act of going back to the text to maintain the authority of that text, and yet it's still, so that it still has legitimacy in your worldview, right? Whereas an institution will be doing these investigations to maintain their own legitimacy to the people, so they can appeal to having done that process that makes them look unbiased, but they just happen to release it in a manner that makes it to where people don't care or notice the results anymore, right? And of course, releasing it now, you see, that's a great example of where there were practical consequences, because for the last 10 years or so, or 8 or whatever, the American people in the West in general have been slowly emotionally prepared or moved into hating Russia, right? And so then that increases the probability of, if there's a scapegoating of Russia maybe, or they indeed are aggressive on Ukraine, but you want to get the military complex behind it, or you're looking for ways to kind of navigate that, or at least have whatever the leader, I think often what happens, it's a priming for whatever the leaders decide. It's not that they necessarily have a plan, but whatever they decide at the time, they want the people to be behind them for whatever that would be. So if you can gradually kind of psychologically and emotionally prime people, when you make your decision, they're going to go with it, right? Because you've gradually eroded the emotional and psychological resistance to those things. And that's what certainly has happened with Russia. Now, the problem is too, because we were talking about last night about the death of process, even making that point now, though, because of how people are, is seen as conspiratorial or seen as supporting Russia or not being in favor of stopping them, because you can't even make those points anymore without being seen as taking a side. Likewise, you can't be seen as even examining how conspiracies work without being seen as supporting conspiracies. And the mainstream media knows that as well. So they can't entertain actual debate. They can't entertain actual discussion, because if they do that, they would be seen as entertaining an evil position or groupthink or conspiratorial reasoning, so they can't do that. So then that's another reason why I think the mainstream media tends to leave these things behind, because if you brought back that story and kind of talked about that report, oh, that means you support Trump. Like, people just assume you support Trump. You're not informing them. You must have an agenda. So then, precisely ironically, the media, in order to not be seen as having an agenda, then has an agenda about not being seen as an agenda, which necessarily sides with a certain political vision. And so then there are all of these ironies happen in the mainstream structure that contributes to then people losing trust in it, which then if they lose trust in it, they go to like the friggin' conspiracy forums because they can't trust the media, right? So it becomes a snake eating its own tail.
Yeah, I think it's like, definitely there's a game being played in which epistemic authority, they want like to keep that epistemic authority. So they're like, as you were saying, we're going to tell the truth, but we're going to do it. We're going to do it in a certain way at a certain time where it's politically inconsequential. But by doing it, we're still, look, we tell the truth, you know, we still have that. So that when they do tell you more bullshit, you know, you believe them. So yeah, which is kind of what I was trying to point to earlier, which is like, it's almost better if they just didn't tell you the truth ever than if they tell you the truth when it's in this manipulative way, you know? But I was wondering what you guys thought about the recent kind of UFO and like aliens are real now kind of thing, because I think we're kind of entering into like the most absurd, you know, psyop moments ever, because I just look at this stuff and I don't even watch this stuff. I don't read about it. I just see the headlines and I just go, no, I'm out. It's gone too far.
Yeah, like I've heard that UFOs are a thing, but this keeps, every couple of years everyone's like, oh, the government confirmed something. What's actually happened? You know more about this than me.
Oh yeah, man, I'm deep into the UFOs. No, but a few things. So apparently a very high-ranking U.S. official that is uniquely high-ranking came out and says the U.S. have alien craft.
Do you know who it is?
I can't remember his name.
What's his like position?
I don't remember. See, this is why you're asking. But I just know he's higher up, okay? You know, that is the starting of the conspiracy. I met this guy named Q. He told me, okay, just don't ask me where. No, I said, but it's all over the news. And he is, look, he's uniquely high up. This is the highest ranking sort of official to come out and make these claims. So everyone's going, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. Now, a few things. I did want to note this. I sometimes wonder if like government workers love conspiracies, because then when they go to parties, people think they have secret knowledge when really all they do is tax forms and it's really boring. So it really helps their status. They're like, oh, I have a really important job.
Yeah, the average like FBI agent is a pencil pusher. Like,
so all this stuff is great for status. Like you're like the freaking Gnostic. You have the secret truths that no one knows. So there's kind of an ancient religion structure, I guess, like kind of Gnosticism to the conspiracy as well, that actually government officials can benefit from, because maybe they as subjects can like feel like people think they're important because they have a truth they're not sharing, and when they don't share that truth, that only confirms they have it. So it's great for the ego. But anyway, Eric Hole, I think that's that Substack guy, you know, he released an article that I find very compelling. I think it's true that most UFO stories come out around the summertime, which is when the media gets the less clicks. Like no one's like clicking links or anything. It just happens to be the case that the media gets really interested in UFOs whenever it's their down season, like the lull season. And then it like people click on and they're like, oh my gosh, UFOs and UFOs. So I do think some of it is of the interest of the, you know, the media trying to get clicks or whatever, because UFOs is always popular because it's like this mysterious thing that we don't know about. Because we're all like, everyone like loves doom or mystery. Those are just things we're attracted to. And also we can just get into the, you know, the conspiracy that a lot of people have that the US government is going to like fake a UFO landing as a way to control us. That's a good spicy one. You know, the fake UFO invasion scenario where they'll use, you know, UFOs or whatever to psychologically control people. That's one that's been going around for a long time. So, you know, maybe that's what we'll get one summer when they need the clicks.
Well, you live on a farm, so I don't know, you would see crop circles and your cows going missing or something. You would know. But yeah, no, I think you're basically right about that. But it's just strange how, like, I feel like the media is taking up almost a conscious effort now to basically use the already pre-existing paranoia, and basically just, I don't know what, like mess with people or something. Like, it's weird.
Well, the UFO, in the same way that like government conspiracies work so well, precisely because it is plausible the government is lying to you, and that's all you need, right? You say it's plausible the government lies to you, and then then it's just a limit of the collective consciousness coming up with what goes from that. It is plausible in a universe that is so big that mathematically speaking, there would be other life, right? That's what a lot of people say, right? It's just probable that there are aliens. Well, then that's all you need, right? Like conspiracies have to be centered on something that strikes the average person as plausible, right? Like we know people have seen UFOs or claim to have seen them. It appeals to reason that in a very large universe, there are other life forms. And it stands to reason that the government would hide it up. And if you think about it, that's an example of two conspiracies coming together, right? Like the government is corrupt and hides things, and there's these UFOs that are hiding their identity from us, or they're like monitoring us, right? So you put them together, you got a package deal, and it takes off from there.
I always thought that like the idea that the government would fake, like, so for like a lot of these sightings and encounters, I sometimes think maybe it's not just people kind of being a bit crazy or seeing things and being paranoid, but like maybe there's actually like a part of the government agency that's going out there dressing up as aliens and like scaring people to make news headlines. It's like just to screw with people. And like that almost scares me more than actual aliens. It's like, why would you do this to people? Yeah. You know, like it's kind of like Scooby-Doo. It's like, you know, it's like you think you're dealing with like a supernatural entity, and then you realize you're dealing with like the local mayor or something who wants like planning for an alley. And like that's almost even worse, because like especially when you're a kid, it's like if there's monsters and aliens, then you know we can fight the monsters and aliens. But like if you're town mayor or you're the captain of the police or whatever, or your school teacher is actually like a completely degenerate, corrupt person who's going to go out of their way to like screw everyone for their own financial interest. That's worse, in my opinion, than
humans are the real
aliens.
You know, it's weird. Have you ever seen that map where it's like it's a map of the world and it's got like a dot for all the UFO sightings, and like, you know, there are some in the rest of the world, but they're pretty much all, and it covers completely covers the country in Britain, the United States of America, and Canada. Like it just seems to be like Anglophone countries. This seems to be a phenomenon within, basically.
But like not anywhere else.
There's like sparsely placed everywhere else, but it seems like an Anglo-speaking phenomenon for some reason. It's very strange.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who theorize, they claim that UFO sightings skyrocketed after Hiroshima and nuclear bombs, and that UFOs tend to show up around nuclear, like countries that have nukes. Because they're apparently the big running idea is that the UFOs, like nuclear weaponry, is something that the Galactic Federation, or whatever term we want, doesn't like. So they really monitor, like.
Or they see it. That's the thing they see. They don't see like radio transmission, but they see like, a nuclear explosion.
Oh, dude, that would be a good twist in the book. We got to put that in. That would be good. Yeah, like apparently nuclear, like some people, like one of the ideas is that the nuclear explosion rips through space and time. And when you develop weaponry that rips through space-time, then the aliens come to monitor you. So that's how they explain that map. But you see, here's the problem, right? That could make sense. That's the problem. That's what keeps a conspiracy alive, right? Like the plausibility, then you keep going. Right. And then it's difficult. Look, like when you see, like, there are thousands upon thousands of not just cow mutilations, but like there's literally like cat mutilations, squirrel mutilations, all these different things. And it's pretty weird. Right. It's pretty weird.
Yeah. But this is another thing. It's kind of like that saying, don't ascribe to malevolence what you can ascribe to incompetence. Because that's one thing is like, that's why the Q one is so successful, because people almost want to believe their government's really competent.
Yes, someone's in control. Absolutely.
More likely to be incompetent, and I suppose that's where the kind of deep state thing comes from. Because you see the elites from the surface, and you're like, these people are like unimpressive and very incompetent. I want there to be like a deep state that's really pulling the strings. When it comes to like the whole mutilation thing, is like, I don't know, man. I think it's more likely there's some freak out there with a knife and a chainsaw.
It could be. I mean,
knife and a chainsaw.
I'm not
likely than.
Oh, sure. I'm not saying it's not, but it's weird enough to be enough to create a lore, right? Like once you get like, apparently Yetis are a part of the UFO things too, right? Like Bigfoot is connected. This is the thing. Like you can just connect. Basically what ends up happening is anything strange can be related, right? It's almost like in set theory where like if you have a null set, they're all isomorphic to one another. Like every weird myth can then be connected with every other myth. But then, of course, the moment you say myth, a lot of people that are hearing that would say there's a value judgment in that. That's what makes this very difficult to discuss, right? We do know there are true conspiracies. How do you talk about this weird stuff without having the language laced with value judgments, which then people emotionally react to hearing, and that shuts down the discussion, right? That's why, for me, asking the question, what is the nature of thought in general, given that it can produce conspiracies, is really fascinating. What is rationality given conspiracies? The other thing I would note with conspiracies is they're definitely structured, like QAnon especially is structured like a video game. Like it's definitely like a level up. There's like a place you need to go. There's like a group.
Explain.
There's a wonderful article on Medium where a video game designer did a comparison of QAnon, and he was talking about like all the parallels you see on how a conspiracy forms in the way that, Q never gave you all the information at once. He gave you a little bit as you advanced more, as you investigate, as you met up with other people who had secrets. It was like a world RPG kind of thing. And also he would note, like as a game developer, one of the great difficulties of game development is like if you have some people testing and they find like this, they're trying to it's a puzzle game and they're trying to open a wall and there's like a leaf in the corner. They start thinking the leaf is part of the way of opening the door, and the game develops like, oh crap, I forgot to remove that leaf. So then they're stuck, like the game's ruined because they're going to spend like the whole game thinking they're onto something when they're not. And there's no way in the video game to tell them that they're on a dead end. So this is something game developers get stuck in all the time.
I think this whole conversation with game theory is actually something I haven't thought about, but is super interesting because that connects it to something physiological we can explain. Like, what's the reason we really like video games, right? Because it literally engages our dopaminergic circuits.
Absolutely.
And what dopaminergic circuits are made to recognize as patterns. And so, you have a pattern in a video game, like you realize that, this power I just got correlates to knocking these locked doors down or whatever, right? But also, when it comes to things like conspiracies, there is like, and again, this comes back to the whole internet point and the fact that we're in the information age. There's so much information. Like even if we're giving completely, like we're just given noise, just random information, humans will go and like search for patterns in that.
Yes.
And they will not only search for patterns, they will be rewarded in a like positive feedback loop, which then again reinforces the pattern matching. And the thing about Q, which is so like weird and kind of exposes that fact about humanity, is the fact that, you think Q, if he really wanted to like leave the breadcrumbs and lead people to something, he wouldn't be so like cryptic about it.
Yeah.
He would just say the thing.
Yeah.
Like, he would just say, oh, this person's doing this, and it wouldn't be like, the jam is in the donut. That's like a bit of code or something like that. Like, but the thing is that that gamification of, those information drops and that sort of thing, it engages that like pattern matching in people's brains. And so when those patterns are matched up, or when people, they crack codes the way we see it, we actually get like a dopamine like reward from that. So it's like, it has the same, someone who's really into conspiracies and, spends a lot of time researching some of these things, is that they're actually engaging the same circuits, which would reward like a drug addict, for example.
Yes. No, I mean, a few things to it. I mean, like, so for example, in Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which was amazing, like when you find the hook shot in a temple, you automatically know, oh, this is going to help me solve some of the other puzzles, right? Like, it's just kind of given. Well, imagine that you went in and you found like the light arrow when you needed the hook shot. You would like spend the next 20 weeks trying to solve the puzzles with the light arrow. And that's not what you do. You need the hook shot in the other temple, right? The game would be endlessly confusing and you would waste a lot of time. But if you wanted to believe, that that item you found in the water temple is going to help you solve it, well, then you can do that forever, right? And then what can you do? You can play Zelda. Then Ocarina of Time never ends. And one of the great tragedies is when Ocarina of Time ends, right? Sure. So there's a real sense in which a conspiracy is a masterpiece of desire in a kind of Lacanian sense. Because for Lacan, desire works by keeping you from accessing the object. Like once you get what you want, the desire dies.
And replaced by a new desire.
That's correct. That's correct. But then you start losing hope in your desires, because every time you get a desire and you get the object, it fails. So the next desire you start to have less faith in and less hope in. What if you had a desire that precisely your inability to find the object of desire confirmed the object existed? And that's what a conspiracy is. If you can't solve the conspiracy, that confirms it's a conspiracy. And so desire is the perfect Lacanian enterprise. And Mr. Hunter Coates, wrote a wonderful book on Lacanic conspiracy that I highly suggest. And absolutely the structure of a conspiracy is like the Lacanian subject. And then I'll also say that absolutely mythos in general are kind of like video games. Like every kind of myth gives you it's not just a story, but it's a story that kind of gives you a call on your life that turns reality as a whole into kind of the playing field of that mythos, right? Like if you believe in Jesus, then there's certain leveling up you can do to be more like Jesus. Reality is interpreted as participating in that certain story. So it has a kind of video game effect on reality that seems to actually be necessary for human beings. And this could get into your work like Owen on like thymos and these structures of ways to rise to your occasions. Like human beings, like if we're talking ontology, there is something about games that human beings require. The question is, what are those games? Are they arbitrary? Are we better for those games? Are we worse for those games? We as a society have not owned games in a way. We've had sports, but they tend to be professional sports, not for the average person. Like if you think about it, most people, their relation to sports is watching sports, not doing sports. That's very, very different. And there seems to be something like when you have a society that's not able to provide people with games by which they can find out if they're going to rise to the occasion, well, then conspiracies can alter that.
Well, actually, that reminds me of Scientology, because Scientology has these levels. It's all the level, right? Like it's all structured on. I think it's weird. Peter Sloterdijk's book, "You Must Change Your Life," starts with a kind of like, like not stupid, but a kind of appraisal of Scientology from a kind of slightly ironic sense, because he's saying like they developed within the modern world this exact thing that people were missing, which was like this rising to the occasion, like this what we might now call self-improvement or something like that, like this desire to stage level up. And I think that there's something clearly about conspiracies that would do that, but from the perspective of like of hidden knowledge. It's not necessarily improvement in like, can I lift more, can I run for longer, can I don't know what, like hold my breath for longer underwater. It's like, it's not physical. It's as you were, it's kind of dark knowledge, hidden knowledge. Where can you find it, and so on. And you definitely do see that in video games, and film, and I think it's quite missing in our life today because people would often sit around a campfire, a long, long time ago and discuss what's in the woods. You know what I mean? Like discussing what's hidden, what's dark, what's out there. And I think aliens do that. And I'm actually going camping on the weekend. And now I'm going to think about aliens all the time. And it's funny because it's like we have this conversation. I'm in my brightly lit living room and I have a coffee and I feel very comfortable and I'm sitting, but aliens are so silly. But if I was to go, I'm not going on my own, but if I was to go on my own, I wouldn't be able to help but just look up there and go, I don't know, I may not sleep very well tonight, you know? There's always that little bit of you which needs that dark knowledge, that hidden, weird, external, unexplainable thing. Yeah.
Which conspiracy guys do you guys believe
in? That's a good one.
So I should just which conspiracy? Sorry, I shouldn't have said theories.
Which conspiracy you believe in?
I'm affecting your ontology by adding theories on the end.
Yeah, I know. I had to think about that. Which conspiracies do I believe in?
Yeah.
Well, I'll have to think about that. Give me a second. The comment that Raymond just made, I really like, where like talking about aliens in the woods has a different emotional feel than talking about it here. I think that's why government conspiracies work, because you're under government. Like you're in the setting and context of government. That then makes it feel more plausible and risky to not take seriously, right? Like when you're like here talking about aliens, it's like there's not a feeling of risk, right? But if you're in the forest, you're like, what, did the aliens hear me? And like there's a mutilated Raymond, that would be bad. So that would not be good. So I think that's really interesting. I also want to know conspiracies require a kind of ethics. And what I mean by that is like take Pizzagate, right? There's a ring where politicians are abusing children or different things. You're made to feel that if you don't look into it, you're forsaking the children. Like children being abused is a very powerful tool of conspiracies because it's like the worst thing imaginable. It's like Ivan Karamazov kind of stuff, right? And so there's an ethical weight. Here's the issue. It's like there's an ethical weight that compels you to look into it. But the moment you look into it, you've stepped into its system of thought that then confirms it and now you can't escape, right? Like that can actually happen in, say, Christianity, right? Like if you don't believe in Jesus, you go to hell. So there's an ethical concern, and also it's the right thing to do to believe in God. I think conspiracies almost always have to have ethics. Like there always have to be some kind of ethical drive to it. And that's actually why, in all honesty, the UFO conspiracy of them all is the one I do take the most kind of interest in and probably think there's probably something going on to it, if I'm answering your question, because there's not as much there's not the ethical push to believe in UFOs like there is these other ones, and yet a lot of people still do. Or a lot of people claim they've had experiences when they don't have the epistemological structure of being ethically compelled into it. And then UFOs are not things that are so easy to structure your experience of phenomenon in their favor. Like if you believe, for example, in Pizzagate, it's very easy to then turn on the news and see people acting in a way that would seem to confirm that possibility, right? But like a UFO mutilating an animal or a ship going across the sky, that doesn't lend itself into everyday experiences as much. And there's a lot of people that claim to have had those experiences. I mean, Frank, they had like a conference in 1994 where they brought all these people that claimed to have alien abductions, and no one wanted to go. Like they had to like force people to go because they were so humiliated to tell their stories. But then they told stories, and like in many of the stories, they had the same repeating pattern of a tall blonde guy. A lot of them said the little gray men were actually robots instead of biological units. Like there were a lot of parallels between people that couldn't have been coordinated. So maybe there's something to that. But I also wanted to comment, it wouldn't surprise me though if it isn't kind of government coordinated, because I definitely think the government probably runs experiments to see how easily they can manipulate people psychologically. Like you need to like almost done field tests to see how susceptible people are to thinking certain things. And there is the possibility that a lot of it is kind of like field tests to experiment with how people respond to certain stories and different things. But of them all, some of the UFO stuff does seem like it might have plausibility to it.
So you think tall blonde aliens have visited the Earth?
I'm not, you're asking me, do I believe? You see,
stop
when you
being
ask,
general. Get substantive here.
Do I
Speaking
believe?
In generalities.
I don't have enough to. No, I don't believe it.
No.
But of all of the conspiracies, I guess for me, when you ask me that question, like if there was a conspiracy that I thought had the highest probability of bearing fruit, like would not just be a self-confirming system, it would probably be that.
Sure.
But I haven't done the work, so I can't give you a cent. But I would say I would be most willing to do that.
What about you, Raymond?
What was the question? Like, what conspiracy is the most compelling? Or because I think compelling would be probably a better way of framing it than believe. Because
thank you, Raymond. That's what I was trying to get at. Thank you.
One way to cover your ass.
But like, I don't know. Like, for me, the UFO one is a bit creepy and a bit fun. But like, I don't. It's not something that would has ever like bothered me or like really thought too much about. The ones that I find interesting are probably things that change history that haven't been found out. I think that's important. And I think that's why I was drawn towards 9/11 when I was like a teenager, because I was like, if this is told the wrong way, everything that was a consequence of that event is now in a different perspective. So I think that, and I think the JFK one has that appeal as well. It's like if it's true, everything like it kind of retroactively changes everything that's happened since then. And I think those ones are compelling for that reason. The other ones I find slightly interesting are like cryptozoology ones, like Bigfoot, Chupacabra. I don't know why. I just think they're interesting. I have absolutely no like rational explanation for it. So yeah, those two. What about you, Sam?
I'm not sure the Dark Ages happened.
Well, that's a good one.
I think that there's so many gaps that it's not entirely clear that the years happened in the time period that we seem to think they did. Like, it's either a lot shorter or a lot longer than we thought.
Dang. I don't know anything about that.
Yeah.
That sounds interesting.
It's just because there's a lack of record. Like, writing and records was so prolific. And then, you have to wait until people start like taxing parishes basically again to get like proper records with like specific times. It's not clear that those years actually happened.
Do you think it's the Men in Black memory forgetter thing that the aliens used on the human race?
No, it's much more boring. I think that people didn't write shit down. That's what I think.
I definitely think calling it the Dark Ages is very problematic.
But that's wrong as well.
Yeah. That's definitely
true. If you just look at things like the population levels and stuff, there were like booms and stuff, and they don't like. There's a reason why it's the high like Middle Ages. Like there was things going on, but they're not things that we find valuable today. So we just assume that it was like pointless.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Because all the intellectual development, all like the spiritual and like architectural development was happening in like monasteries and stuff. And we sort of view that lifestyle as kind of pointless now today. It's like because they weren't inventing things like physical things and advancing technology and improving economically, we just assume that it was like a dark and pointless time,
Oh, that's funny because they weren't doing what according to our metrics is a good use of time. So we just say,
that's what I think. That's what I think, honestly.
The dark.
I mean, to your question though, I would say that there is no conspiracy. Like if I'm forced to say what conspiracy strikes me as possibly most plausible, that's different from if you were to ask me, do I think there is any conspiracy that is worth the time of exploring?
Sure.
And I don't think there is. Like even the alien one, like let's say there are, like what would me as an individual gain intellectually, emotionally, so on and so forth from
this
engaging
is
in that?
I wanted to bring up when you guys were talking about the alien stuff, because just to take it as like Raymond, you said like historical events that change history, right? Like 9/11 is one of those things where, well, depending on who you ask, but it happened, and it's not something that the government can kind of sweep under the carpet.
Sure.
Like it has to be acknowledged, and I think like with the alien stuff, like lots of the conspiracies are saying, oh, the government knows about this and they're hiding it or whatever, right? And I think honestly, the confirmation of that, if it became part of the official narrative, would be like probably one of the biggest things to happen in all of history ever. But to do that, it either has to be so monumental that it cannot be ignored, or it needs to be deliberately made part of the narrative by the regime. I suspect what we have right now in the news is actually a distraction from other stuff.
Sure.
That's kind of what it would take for it to become epistemologically acceptable, if I was to use that phrasing.
There's one conspiracy which we'll all find a little bit interesting as people who write, is the one where people argue that this author wasn't really an author. For example, Shakespeare was a woman. or Socrates didn't exist. Plato made him up. Those are two which I find pretty interesting, because it's like, why is there a conspiracy around authorship? That seems like an interesting topic. I don't know why, but it seems like strange.
This is another thing. The Shakespeare one's interesting. It's a shame Joshua Hanson's really deep on this one.
Oh yeah, was it Edinburgh or whatever? Edinburgh.
Oh my god, that was an offensive pronunciation.
Yeah, it was, because I'm a Virginian.
No, it's like the Duke of Essex or something.
Essex, yes. Yeah.
But anyway, what I find really interesting about the Shakespeare one is, and I feel the same way about, people really care about whether Jesus existed,
Sure.
what color his skin was, did he have brothers, all this sort of like
weird, that's a good one too.
Very like specific stuff. Like they're like, oh well, was Shakespeare the actual author? Did Shakespeare actually exist? Like all these sorts of things. Is Shakespeare actually like a collaboration between a bunch of different authors? Yeah. It's very interesting because I think that intellectually speaking, I mean historically speaking is a different question, but intellectually speaking, the way Jesus and Shakespeare are in the zeitgeist, they are actually like they are avatars of ideas.
Sure.
And so what I think is actually interesting is not the historical Jesus, but what effect Christianity has had.
Sure.
So in fact, when you talk about Jesus and his effects, someone like Paul is actually way more intellectually important because of the New Testament than Jesus himself in a way. Because a lot of the New Testament was written a long time after Jesus was around. And then likewise with Shakespeare, let's just say that, okay, it was actually, a bunch of different people were collaborators on all the Shakespeare plays. It doesn't actually matter. Like,
sure,
it doesn't make them not great literature. Right. It doesn't make their themes not important. It doesn't make them not important in English history. Like, I understand there's like a historical question, but I find it like the Shakespeare one, we'll go back to that specifically, is like, I want to know, because I'm very confused as to why people care about whether he was actually the author or not. Because I don't care. I don't think it's actually important to what Shakespeare is as an intellectual force,
So that's actually really interesting. Now I'm thinking about a bunch of things. Like, why is it we use basically the same word to describe Bigfoot, aliens, 9/11, Shakespeare's a conspiracy?
And Jesus.
Like, it's interesting that we have this one word that does so much for so many different subjects that seem quite different. So maybe there's a subconscious underlying theme, and the author, the death of the author, the missing author, that's kind of an interesting framing of it. I think a lot of people with the Shakespeare debate say that if the system of power wants you to believe that an everyday average person could turn into Shakespeare, so then the system doesn't have to reform itself, where if it's someone in power who becomes Shakespeare, then that can almost be used, then it would say, yeah, of course it was someone in power who became Shakespeare because the system was in their favor, right? But if you can create a kind of a mythos where, an everyday person could turn into the greatest English writer ever, the system doesn't have to reform itself. In fact, the system works great, because it was able to give you a Shakespeare. Likewise, if you say God was like the poor and cast out, well, then the poor and cast out shouldn't complain, because look, they can be the son of God, right? So you could bring a kind of Marxist reading in some respects into it, I think is what people would say. And then it would also, it like could contribute to a kind of opioid of the people, right? Where you accept a sort of mythos where the world is made by people from the bottom of the rung, which is exactly what the people at top want you to believe, so that you don't try to change things, right? So I think that's kind of the argument some people make.
Yeah, I think there's definitely also a theme there, kind of you were touching on it, of like genius, where does it come from? Because it's extremely hard to like we can't control that. Like, you can give everyone all the opportunity they could possibly have and all the privilege, and they may just be mediocre, and someone else may not have a lot and they may just be genius. So I think there's a kind of I guess a need to kind of almost politically contain that. Like, where does it come from? Is it constructed or given, or is it coming from like almost a supernatural place and just emerging itself completely randomly into our society with no sort of control? So there's a kind of meritocratic theme to that as well, which reminds me a little bit of Plato and like the attempt to undermine kind of like aristocratic inherited privilege in favor of some sort of meritocratic system where the there's no real way of knowing who will be the philosopher king they'll just kind of reveal themselves to us, you know, in this. But obviously, you need a system based around education and like watching who will be like, you know, who is the chosen one, who is going to be revealed. So yeah, there's definitely a kind of similar theme there. Actually, there's one thing I wanted to bring up before I forget, which is about aliens, and I wanted to get your perspective on it because I always hear people when they talk about aliens say that that aliens wouldn't interact with us because we're too like lower than them, or like we're too barbaric or something, or like we're just like insects to them, or like them coming down to interact with us would be the equivalent to us like going to like a frog pond and like picking up tadpoles and messing with them and then putting them back or something. Like somehow, for some reason, we're like ontologically so much lower than them. And I thought that's weird because it's like, why are we ontologically lower than them? Like that is like why do conspiracy people assume that? It seems like a weird thing to assume.
It's weird. There's a weird connection there because we also, when we were talking about the government conspiracy theories, there is an assumption there that they are so much more capable than we are, and they are kind of the above thing, pulling the strings and being omnipresent and omnipotent, and all these sorts of things. And it plays the same part as like a deity, pretty much. Like people always seem to want to believe in a power greater than themselves, you know. And it's so weird how, you know, that would have been God or gods in the past, and it's sort of like transfigured itself onto governments and, you know, possibility of life elsewhere. You know, one of the things I mean, just to round off the life elsewhere in the universe point, is I think it's very possible. Like this is one of the proposals on the Fermi paradox, pretty much. I think it's very possible that we haven't found anything because we're looking for another Earth. Like we're looking for another rocky planet with like, you know, ground like Earth, and with a, you know, certain composition to its air that is a certain temperature and is a certain distance from a certain type of star. And it's very possible that the majority of life in the universe could be like just completely aquatic and be completely used to different conditions than us. Like there's the moon of Jupiter, which is like an ice planet, which has like an ice crust, and then is pretty much just completely water underneath. Like it's likely that we're just like not looking in the right places. And this kind of leans into your point a little bit, Raymond, is that the lack of imagination in what other life could look like is, you know, like all the other life in the universe could just be like squids. Yeah. Like, and not even like complex squid people. They're not like out there, you know, with really complex technology and stuff. Like, I'm not even sure how an aquatic race would get to something like electricity, for example. Like, how would that even like work?
I'd be like dropping the toaster in the ocean.
Exactly,
it would not work out.
There's a severe, and this applies to lots of things, you know, when people say something, you know, like something's not possible politically, there's like a severe lack of imagination. And I think that the easy answers of conspiracy theories often lean into that lack of imagination, you know?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, I guess we terramorphosize, like anthropomorphize, like aliens, where like they'll all be like Earth or something, so Earthmorphized or something.
Yeah, and then like all of our reports of, like you said, like as a tall blonde man.
Yeah.
You know, even the grey aliens are like humanoid. They have like 2 arms, 2 legs. Like let's, you know, have a bit of imagination. Like, you know, like the featherless biped thing is probably not what the aliens are, you know?
Well, it is interesting. So if we look, so there's a few things. One, the common structure to all of these conspiratorial topics seems to almost be like, you know, imagine you have a circle, and imagine you have the center of the circle missing. Okay, so you have a circle and you have the center of it missing. When you see a shape like that, you would assume there is a center that I need to fit into that, right? When it's completely possible that the shape actually is just a circle missing the center. That could be what it is. For Lacan, that is the subject, basically. The subject is kind of, it has a hole in it. And all of these conspiracies seem to have the structure of the subject, where like with Q, like there is no Q, for example, but there's all the people who believe in it that then create an organic structure that makes it look like there is a center. It just hasn't been found yet, right? So there's always, you know, and I guess the great, you know, actually a lot of the Japanese programming is really good on this. Like Cohn did Paranoia Agent, Millennial Actress. They're really good on conspiracy. Ghost in the Shell has a concept of the standalone complex. And basically that's what you see here. They all have this kind of structuring that is organic that makes it look like there's a laughing man in season 1 orchestrating everything, when really the laughing man is more of a meme. It's more of a meme of information that then creates an effect of seeming like there's a guy organizing it all, but there's not. But then again, maybe that's what the guy organizing it all wants you to think. Like, you always have that possibility that then makes the feeling of an ethical like drive to just check to make sure. Let's just check to make sure. Like this whole alien, like right now, like everything you just did thinking about the alien problem was actually an example of using intelligence, right? You said, well, wait a minute, like why can't they be more ocean-based, aquatic or something like that? That was intelligent. But this is the funny thing. Intelligence doesn't stop itself from being used even when it's about something that might not be relevant. And you can actually exercise intelligence in the act of considering something that might not have any correspondence with reality, right? You have that power in having the ability to think. But you see, you're not going to be like sucked up into thinking about fish aliens because there's no ethical drive to do it. But what if I told you that aliens might come for your children? What if I told you that aliens might take your job? Or like that South Park episode that was hilarious. What if I were to tell you that aliens are somehow a threat, right? Well, then you might like really pour all your time and energy into it. And now you're going to end up like you're in a Thomas Pynchon novel, which Thomas Pynchon's Crying Lot of 49 is extremely useful for thinking conspiracies, right? Because there's now a threat, right? One of the reasons that's interesting to me with the alien thinking, again, another reason why it's of interest to me, even though I'm not going to spend all my time thinking about it, is because aliens are weird, because if you can't actually think they're a threat, because if they were more advanced than you and they were a threat, they would have already destroyed you, right? So you have to do this weird thing with aliens that doesn't really fit the typical conspiratorial structure, which is in most conspiratorial structure, they stay alive precisely because there's like a principle of threat that's pushing them. But whenever anyone talks about the threat of aliens, it kind of doesn't ring the same way as like a Pizzagate, because you're like, well, if they're so advanced, they could destroy us. They're so powerful, they're not a threat. And yet the fact that so many people still ascribe to them or think about them would suggest that there is some sort of sightings that would give weight to them, because it seems to have a different structure than most other conspiracies. Right. So again, I'm not going to spend any time studying it, but if there was any one, I would, because it seems to be unique, more unique in its structure from other conspiratorial subjects. It might be more worth, it might have a higher payout of time.
One thing I find quite interesting is the difference between pro-social and anti-social conspiracy theories. Like, it's seen as like, and I think this contributes to containment, is it's seen like, oh, I'm so quirky, I believe the moon landing was fake, or I'm so quirky, I think the JFK assassination was inside job. Which is like, they are like pro-social, like socially acceptable conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
But to believe that there is, like a
inside job 9/11 or something.
Inside job 9/11's one. The Sandy Hook thing's one.
Sure.
Chemtrails is definitely an antisocial one.
Sure.
The questions over whether there is a deliberate effort to change the demographics of certain countries is another one that's very antisocial.
Sure.
And I find that quite interesting. And this comes into, I was saying about, the aliens thing is like, it either is going to be so unignorable that it's in the news, or the regime is going to allow it to become part of the narrative, and it will become. And actually, the aliens one is pro-social.
Yeah, I think so. It's become pro-social. It used to not be, but now it actually has gradually become more pro-social. That's actually an interesting case study. Why? Why has it become more acceptable?
Yeah, because right now that's not a threat to the regime, right? But
doesn't seem like it. No.
Yeah, but the Q stuff, as to give an example, is one of the things that is bubbling up under the talk about certain states seceding, or people talking about, well, if you want my guns, to come and get them, all that sort of discourse. That's actually like a threat to the regime, even though. I don't think there's much. But it is a threat to the regime for people to believe that narrative.
That's interesting. I guess the irony with UFOs is they're not a threat because if they were, like, they're too powerful. It's a weird way, like if they're too powerful, they don't function as a threat, because if they were a threat, they would have already done something. But so I'm thinking about that. I also wanted to note there's something about a conspiracy cannot be too out there. I guess I was saying that, like, if it was like truly, truly mysterious, you couldn't relate to it, and therefore it wouldn't have any power. So it has to be different enough to be interest, but intelligible enough to kind of pull you in, right? So there's something that has happened where UFOs feel like you can be intelligent and believe them. Like where there are the other ones you can't.
Well, actually, it leads into the whole the religion of scientism as well.
Sure.
Like it's seen as a very like scientific thing to believe in the eschatology of alien life and our ascension to the stars. You know.
Yeah, that's interesting because aliens confirms where science is going to take us.
Yeah.
See, look, science is great.
Also, like if aliens come down from the heavens and not God, it confirms like the "where's your God now" sort of thing. You know?
It confirms science.
Yeah,
yeah.
Also, a lot of those ancient alien shows kind of depict, like they go back in history and they say this old ancient artwork actually depicts aliens coming down, not gods, it's aliens. Or like Plato's Atlantis or something, it's like, oh, actually he's referring to fucking aliens or something. Like they kind of have this historical revisionism of where they replace the metaphysics of divinity with aliens, like, you know. So it's like as you were saying, it almost is like a scientist theology replacement.
That's interesting, because if it was aliens all along, then we can do away with the humanities. You know, there's like a way where like thinking, philosophy, and metaphysics, like if these people in the past, and like modern life kind of sucks, and these people in the past had this thing, so maybe they were better off. No, it was actually science and aliens. Oh, so we are on the right track. Like that's kind of interesting to make you not go back to the past and think you need to take seriously some of these humanitarian trainings if you can reinterpret them as the perpetual presence of science and technology the whole time. That's interesting. It's like, oh, Plato and Aristotle thought they were so clever, but haha, they weren't. They were just being tricked by these aliens, and we know. And like it's almost like a conspiracy of STEM against the humanities. Like trying to usurp our authority from us. Dude, alien revisionism. I am all
Lots of times it's historical revisionism, but alien revisionism.
That is a new freaking PhD, if I ever heard one. But that's interesting because you kind of like, you need the successes of the past to be products of like science and technology to make people feel comfortable with where science and technology is taking them now. Because if you look to the past and go, hey, they look like they were pretty happy or pretty smart and they didn't put all their eggs in the baskets of STEM, that would like be a threat to power. But if it's all aliens and it's all technology all the way down, then it's comfortable to put your eggs in that basket. So maybe that's a reason why the narrative is not a threat to power. In fact, it's great for power because it confirms that everything good in history is a product of STEM.
And also, because this makes perfect sense because conspiracies which are aimed at scientific authority are generally seen as bad and antisocial.
Interesting.
Like the vaccines, for example.
Sure.
But conspiracies which are aimed against classical historical figures, Shakespeare, Plato, ancient mythology, these are all good. These are all very, very good. And I think it's interesting too, because there's also an assumption with the idea that like aliens wouldn't interact with us because we're too insignificant. It's like, okay, so what makes them higher? And if you were to ask somebody who's saying this, they would say, well, they have spaceships that can travel. It's like, okay, so they have fast transportation. That's what makes them higher. It's like, it's purely technical. They don't have great artwork. They don't have great music. They don't have great literature. They're not great warriors. They just have fast fucking planes, basically, you know, or like something like that, you know.
No, I mean, that's very interesting. So now we're talking about the STEM conspiracy behind conspiracies. That is grand. I'm so happy. The STEM conspiracy behind conspiracies. That's how I that's really interesting. Well, I will know that actually, if you really want to get into the fun weeds, there's the difference between the popular alien narrative that's very pro-STEM, but then there's a lot of people who claim to be abducted, who talk about like aliens like being interested in humans precisely because of the spiritual dimension that aliens don't have, like consciousness, like remote viewing, telekinesis. Like there's people that are like, no, it's like there's something about human life that is uniquely spiritually capable that aliens are not, and that's why they're interested in Earth, even though we have nothing to give them. No, we do. For some reason, biological life is uniquely capable of emerging to spiritual realities that aliens are interested in. You see, that's like another angle that people take at it. That's kind of interesting. And actually, you can get into the whole thing where there are three alien races that are actually fighting over human beings: the lizard people, the tall blondes, and the whites, or something. No, they are the tall blondes, or the grays. There's like three different races.
Yeah, I think it's grays. Yeah.
Freaking Earth, because we have unique freaking spiritual resources. So we can do a straight up like comic book series. It's like Earth is in the center of an alien war. That's one narrative style.
Aliens were just Scandinavian people.
And the Earth is in the center of the galactic volcanization. So, it all comes together.
Cool. So have we got any closing remarks today? What have we learned today?
What have we learned today? That there's a STEM conspiracy behind conspiracies.
Right.
I'm really pleased with that. That's really good.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm happy with the STEM thing. Yeah, that's we've got something out of this anyway.
I think my biggest takeaway is the fact that there are pro-social. Like most people say, like, conspiracy theories are just all noise and that sort of stuff. But I think it's clear that there are pro-social and anti-social ones. I think it's often a good indicator of what's worth the time to look into, and also what, it tells you a lot about the system you live under as well. Like,
yes,
what you cannot say and what you cannot question, like, tells you who's in charge, tells you what people are trying to hide. Like, there's no censorship of JFK assassination videos and moon landing conspiracies on YouTube.
That's correct.
There's censorship of other stuff we've spoken about today.
Yes.
I think that tells a lot. That says a lot.
Well, if you hide, there's, I think, an intentional ventilation. I think what you're saying is very important. Like, you have to make it seem like YouTube is like, no, we're not hiding everything. Look, there are these conspiracies we let you look up videos of, precisely so that you don't question the ones you're not, right? Yeah. But then, of course, maybe there aren't any. So you have this kind of paranoid place, right, where you're left. I mean, for me, the closing things I would say is that it's just really important to realize that the likelihood of believing a conspiracy goes up the smarter you are. Like, rationality, it's not like rationality is, yes, the smarter you are, the more likely you are to believe a conspiracy. Absolutely. Yes. Now, the issue is, the reason why the internet makes things so interesting is that people have at their fingertips that level of intelligence, right? Where they can look up things, they can search. So even someone like of 100 IQ can actually, practically speaking, have access to an intellect that's very high. But the ability to believe, developing schizophrenia, different mental illnesses can go up with IQ because you're able to see connections that other people can't see. You're so good at seeing patterns and connections that they actually might not be there. You're just really good at making them, forcing them to be there, right? Well, if we take seriously that rationality leads to conspiracy just as much as it can lead to genius, then we're going to have to think hard about what genius is, and what we do. And, one of the things that's extremely interesting, and Lorenzo talks about this, when you're trying to rehabilitate people out of, say, QAnon or whatever, which, a lot of times it's kind of like a cult because there's so much peer pressure and emotional manipulation to believe it. One of the key ways to do it is to actually make people put money where their mouth is. Where you say, okay, well, then you come up with a falsifiable claim from QAnon, say Trump will win X election or it'll come back, and you use probability markets and you say, okay, well, put down $100, and if you're right, it will turn into $10,000. And suddenly when you ask people to get money involved, they start doubting. They go, well, maybe not, I don't know. Where money has the ability, skin in the game is really powerful for determining what conspiracies are just a product of social pressure and what conspiracies may actually have legitimacy to it. Because if someone's really willing to put their money down and take in real risk for a conspiracy, that means they probably genuinely believe it and they have good reason to think it. So skin in the game operations could also go a long way to helping us determine legitimate conspiracies and fake conspiracies and mechanisms of skin in the game.
Sure.
Hmm.
Cool.
Well, that was great.
Thanks for joining us, Dan.
Yeah, it was a blast. Schizo FM, everyone. It's freaking amazing.
Signing off.